From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's today's lineup. K-State's Dan O'Brien standing by to remark on this week's sale of U.S. soybeans to China, what that means for the soybean market going forward, and he talks about that latest USDA grain supply and demand report as part of his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Also in today, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz on identifying sulfur deficiency in winter wheat stands. That's becoming a more widespread problem in Kansas. He goes over the options for applying sulfur to wheat as part of a winter topdressing program. And we'll welcome in once again K-State's Mary Knapp to talk Kansas agricultural weather. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are tuned to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today, our Friday edition. Welcome once again. Well, the grain market scene was somewhat eventful this past week. We will cover all of that right here with our guest, Dan O'Brien, from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas, where he serves, as you know, as grain market economist for K-State Research and Extension. So we'll spend a moment on the USDA's latest grain supply and demand numbers. We'll also look at some of your latest thoughts on the corn complex in detail. But let's start with the thing that captured the most attention, it seems, this past week. The first soybean sales to China since the tariff flap really brewed up. And how much of a hallmark was this, Dan?
Well, it's a big thing. Not so much even for the sake of the 41.5 million bushels that were bought yesterday, but more for the promise of what's to come. I think this is a very good time for the Chinese to come in and be looking at U.S. supplies for purchase. They've had a good run of shipments in South America to the place we're even shipping some soybeans to South America to fill in the gap on what they've sent out the door. Again, their own processors have needed some, especially in Argentina. So they're on the hind end of their shipment season. You read of trucking issues, transportation issues coming up now in Brazil that are seemingly hindering some of their ability to get what there is out there of their supplies from the interior areas out to the ports. So some problems coming up there in terms of that other supplier and other supplier of soybeans, i.e. South America as a group, going to China. So again, for the U.S. and China to find a time, particularly China, that would be beneficial for them to avoid disruptions in their domestic feed markets, this would be it. So, of course, lots of politics all involved in this, and issues beyond agriculture involved in these, the discussions that are going on. Mm-hmm. And promise now that for this window of time that we have until the next South American soybean crop comes available, and when is that? You're starting to see just the first trickles of that in February, but often February, March, April, May. I think this is a signal that until those new crops come, that the U.S. will have an opportunity to catch up some on slower sales. So that's all for the good. And really the question is, how much is it? Again, so if we have 41.5 million bushels of sales that have happened already right at the front end of this, I think it's good to keep in mind that the USDA originally projected 2.2 billion bushels of soybeans to be sold in export markets out of the U.S. And then that was about 4 or 5 months ago. And then in the midst of the trade conflict, that number got chopped down by 300 million. So by the time all this works itself out, maybe one way to look at it, in my simple mind, is to think, well, do we get the 300 million back? And if so, what does that do to soybean supply-demand balance sheet. Well, right now, we've got a projection of about 955 million bushels of carryover on the U.S. supply-demand balance sheet for soybeans. That would be August 31st, 2019. And if we get that 300 million bushels back, then that number gets closer, well, it's closer to 700 million, 655 million, something like that. Stocks to use, instead of being 20-some% stocks to use, you're down closer to 12, 13, 14, 15% stocks to use probably. And prices that have been just so-so would receive some positive support. Again, there would be demand pull coming from the exporters to pull soybeans out of wherever they could find it, to buy them out of farmers' hands and then see a benefit. I think maybe the surest issue out there is on the backside of this. There'll come a day when the South American crops become available in 2019, and at that time, I would wonder about still having unsold soybeans by that time. Again, if you're holding on to it, you're looking at the possibility of a drought or some type of disruption in South America. So without that, I think the Chinese very likely to shift pretty quickly to that alternative supply source.
Now, the USDA did put out that World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report. The numbers that were shared on Tuesday, well, they lacked for drama, to put it that way.
They did. Generally, the soybean numbers are based on information that wasn't necessarily accounting for what we just talked about in terms of trade changes. So the supply-demand balance sheet is subject to change. Really, I think what's really going to be interesting is the early January set of reports by the USDA. You'll have the final crop production report, and again, we showed literally no changes in this December WASDE report on the 11th in crop production. All that, if there are any changes or any adjustments, that'll happen in the January report, and I believe that's on the 8th, I believe. That's a market-moving day, potentially. Point is that if we do have any cutback in U.S. production that's occurred because of delayed harvest in points east of here and in some of our own neighborhood, then that's the place where we'd see it. Stocks numbers will come in. There'll be a wheat planting report. We've got thoughts of record lows again in wheat acreage. So just a lot of things coming out in that early January report and something for really farmers to be thinking about in terms of the potential impacts of the numbers out of that report. But in this report, not much was shown for the wheat market and U.S. wheat supply-demand balance sheet. The USDA basically lowered the projection of exports by about 25 million bushels down to 1 billion. Really not a lot of movement. They lowered the exports, raised the stocks, and by the way, raised the average price. So why would they do that? I think that there's still this issue out there of what we'll see coming out of the Black Sea region in the latter part of this marketing year. And you've got, again, Russian wheat production in 2017-18 at 85 million metric tons. This year at 70. So that's 15 million metric ton change. And in the market, when you're dealing with Black Sea regions, you're trying to read the tea leaves. What's important? Well, there's a meeting coming up of the Russian government with exporters to discuss supply-demand conditions and where they go for the rest of the year. Well, they're a little tighter on supplies. So that, to me, is indicative of at least some concern off in that part of the world of where things are going. Of course, we'll look at the condition of their growing crops and all of that. But the point is, there's some of these areas of the world that are important for wheat production aren't doing just wonderfully, and the key one seems to be that what we have to acknowledge anymore is really kind of the market price leading region in the world for wheat, and that right now seems to be the Black Sea region. I would add, too, that the corn supply-demand balance sheet did not have a lot of changes in it, but the one thing that did come in was a cutback by the USDA in its projection of corn for ethanol usage. It's still projected to use 5.6 billion bushels and really are on track for that. But I think that's an acknowledgement of some low profitability in the ethanol processing industry right now, mainly because of low ethanol prices, and some increase in corn prices, and those two things working together causing, by the last numbers we calculated, about a dime or more per gallon losses in October and November. So we'll see. We've had some strength in corn usage for exports, so number of things kind of quietly percolating along that are supporting the corn market. And, we'll see where we go from here. There are some things that can still shift around, and I think you'd mentioned earlier that we've got some information on Ag Manager about potential alternative outcomes of what the USDA is projecting. And really it comes down to whether we have 150 million lower exports, 150 million higher exports, and or do we end up and have a surprise in January with some amount of lower production. I surely would not be surprised to see that the harvest delays we've seen in some areas of the northern Corn Belt would result in some amount, 50, 100 million bushels less of production, and maybe even more. So maybe the most informed thing to say is that there's a lot of information the markets have to digest in early January.
Right. And Dan, briefly, we'd remind folks to an article on the corn market, the expanded outlook that you've put together on agmanager.info. And there is one nugget within that we might finish with, and that is there will be interest going forward in what comes of the corn output from South America, particularly in light of the fact that so many beans are expected eventually out of that region, that coming perhaps at the expense of corn.
That is the one unsettling hand grenade that could happen in the markets. I know that's a hyperbole statement, but the point is, if we have lots of acres of soybeans and lower acres of corn, and if we have a production problem for corn down there, then you'd be adding what is right now an unexpected element into these markets. And when would that factor show up? January, February, March of 2019. So we're not cheerleading for that to happen, but just saying that the one issue that could really upset all of these carefully laid plans that are pretty conservative right now would be a major crop problem down there in South America, particularly Brazil, as we look at the size of their corn crops.
Once more, Dan's fresh new write-ups on the grain markets and the outlook on those can be found at agmanager.info. Producers, take advantage of that information. And again, we'll catch up with you next Friday. Dan, thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, on This Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Continuing on now on This Agriculture Today. Wheat crop management and topics there tend to whittle down considerably at this point of the season, but here's one that's very appropriate for the winter and heading into early spring eventually, and that is the possibility of wheat suffering from a sulfur deficiency. Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz has been good enough to come back by our way again. He is a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And Dorivar, we've been talking this up the last several years for these sulfur shortages in wheat have been a bit more pronounced as we go along, haven't they?
Yes, Eric, this is something that has been becoming more common in recent years. Traditionally, sulfur deficiency has been identified primarily in coarse texture soils, sandy soils that are prone to leaching, very low organic matter soils. Those are traditionally the places where we tend to see sulfur deficiency, but nowadays we basically see it in pretty much any type of soils, especially areas where we have erosion, we don't have good levels of organic matter, and different conditions that may not be conducive to mineralization of sulfur. So any soils in general have the potential now to show some sulfur deficiency.
Especially in no-till conditions then?
Yes, and that's one situation where we may tend to see more often. And again, that goes back to the cycle of sulfur. Basically, we do have most of the sulfur in the soil in the form of organic sulfur. So that basically needs to break down. We need to have that process of mineralization and release of that sulfur for the crop. And in a no-till system, typically with heavy residue, we may not have the conditions, especially early in the season, early in the spring, low soil temperatures in particular, where we don't have that mineralization process still happening fast enough to provide sulfur to the wheat crop. That's also another reason why wheat tends to be the crop that suffers a little bit the most because, again, it's basically growing during the time of the year where soil temperature is lower and we just don't have that mineralization process. So definitely, again, no-till system tends to be a little bit more common to see it because of that cycling. Also, depending on the rotations, we do have some systems where we have more intensive cropping systems. We have soybean in the rotation where we can remove significant amount of sulfur from the soil. And as we intensify this cropping system, we may be leaving very little for the wheat crop in the spring.
And the lack of sulfur availability to wheat can result in damage to the crop to the point of impacting yields?
Yes, absolutely. And we've seen some significant yield responses to fertilizer application. One of the things, I guess, maybe the first thing that we all need to keep in mind is making sure we identify those deficiency symptoms early enough because we do have the possibility for some rescue type application and recover some yields. But one of the challenges also in recent years being that we tend to confuse sulfur with nitrogen in many situations. So some producers sometimes will go back and maybe put extra nitrogen when in reality we really need to be putting some sulfur. And so that's very important to keep in mind, make sure we identify those deficiency symptoms. They can be very similar. We're basically talking about yellow, pale green situation, stunted growth early in the season. So a lot of the deficiency symptoms, especially from the distance, could be very, very similar to nitrogen. But as we get closer, some of the key differences between nitrogen and sulfur is that the yellowing tends to be usually in the younger leaves, in the upper part of the leaves for sulfur, which is basically the opposite for nitrogen. So that's one of the key differences that we tend to see. If you look at where the deficiencies are showing, in the case of sulfur, tends to be very patchy. We tend to see different areas of the field, more often usually in areas where we have some erosion, kind of a side slope areas. Those are the places where we usually tend to see sulfur deficiency show up first. So again, making sure we identify that symptom and consider some options for fertilizer application if we haven't done anything as a top dress or pre-plant application.
Would it, Dorivar, be worth a producer's while to go ahead, if they're not sure, and test for that sulfur level before taking any action?
Yes, and that will actually be our recommendation. We do have a soil test sulfur recommendation in Kansas, so that's one thing that we have to keep in mind. And again, some producers are already doing soil testing in the fall. They may be already tested for sulfur, but that's something that can also be done even now in the winter if we don't have any information on that. There are really a few different components in soil testing that tell us something about sulfur. We do have the profile sulfur, which is similar to the nitrate. We are talking about a mobile nutrient here, so we really need to look at that profile. And specifically for sulfur, this becomes really important because sulfur tends to accumulate in clay layers that we may have in some of our soils. So if we do have some soils with some levels of clay in the profile, we want to make sure and capture that because in many soils we may have a significant accumulation of sulfur in the profile. And if we are only collecting a surface 0 to 6 or 0 to 8 inches, we may not be capturing that sulfur content. And so the profile, about 24 inch, that will be really the recommended sampling for sulfur. Now, we also do have other parameters that will tell us something about sulfur, and that's basically soil organic matter levels. And if we have information about soil texture, those are also indicative of potential soils that may be responsive to sulfur. Again, situations where we have coarse texture, if soil organic matter is coming back low, those will be definitely candidates for sulfur fertilizer application.
And so your soil test results as they arrive back to you as a producer will spell all of that out, what's happening in that particular field. And then, if necessary, one can come in and correct that sulfur deficiency, and there are a number of product options, you say, Dorivar?
Yes, we do have many options. Some producers may be putting sulfur as a top dress application later this winter, early spring. Some may already apply sulfur around planting time, or we do have different options. When it comes to sulfur fertilizer, we have to be a little bit careful because we really have differences in terms of plant availability. It's different from other nutrients like nitrogen, P and K, which is basically what formulation, what's in the bag is basically what should be plant available. In the case of sulfur, could be different. If we're talking, for example, we do have two main groups of fertilizers, dry and liquids. And if we look at the dry sources, one source that could be popular is the elemental sulfur. That's typically high content of sulfur, anywhere from 90-95% sulfur. Could be an excellent source, but we are talking about an elemental form that really needs to be oxidized into a sulfate form, which is what the plant is going to be taking up. So essentially, that elemental sulfur fertilizer is not going to be available to the plant immediately. We do need some time for that to become available. And this is very important if we're talking about top dressing wheat, because if we are putting around top dressing time, more likely that sulfur will not be available for that particular crop. So that's very important to keep in mind. If we are using a source like elemental sulfur, we need to be thinking ahead, make sure for winter wheat, elemental sulfur probably really needs to be applied in the fall. And if we're thinking about other crops like corn, again, we need to apply early enough to make sure that's plant available. Of course, the flip side of that also is because we need that time for oxidation and availability, basically also acts as a slow-release fertilizer, if you will. And some producers been putting small amounts of elemental sulfur and basically provide sulfur for several months in most of our soil. So that's a good potential from elemental sulfur. Again, situations where we have potential for leaching, for example, I think is an excellent source. Now, we do have other dry fertilizer alternatives. Anything that has sulfate, things like ammonium sulfate, is becoming popular again. Ammonium sulfate, of course, has nitrogen. So if we are top dressing wheat, it could be an excellent source providing both nitrogen and sulfur. We do have things like gypsum that could also be plant available. It's basically calcium sulfate. So all of those are good alternatives. In recent years, we also do have some phosphate fertilizer that's also bringing some sulfur in the mix, and there are a few different brands already in the market, and that's also another good alternative. And I know some producers will already be applying phosphorus in the fall at planting time, and some of that may already be including sulfur. Mm-hmm. Those are good alternatives. When it comes to liquid, of course, we do have ammonium thiosulfate, potassium thiosulfate. Those are probably the most popular options, and they can easily be blended with UAN. Producers using liquid for top dressing, again, we can easily blend it with some of these sources for application in the spring. So those are probably some of the main alternatives. The main thing that I would like to emphasize is that we are making sure we are applying a source that will be available immediately if we are intending to provide sulfur for that crop. If we are thinking a little bit ahead and more of a long term, we do have a lot more flexibility, and we can certainly take advantage of cheaper sources like elemental sulfur.
The point, though, is that the investment in whatever sulfur fertilizer application you go with will pay off in terms of crop response. That's been confirmed.
Yes, we do have a fair amount of data now shows significant yield responses in winter wheat. We also do have responses in corn. So definitely in terms of yield response, we do have that benefit. There are also some studies looking at grain quality for winter wheat that providing some benefit there in terms of protein, but most importantly, the type of proteins, amino acids, and baking quality, and so on. So that's also another added benefit that we get specifically for winter wheat. But again, most importantly, in terms of yield response, in those deficient soils, we are seeing pretty consistent response.
Good heads up on this, Dorivar. We appreciate the time and the comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. There's an article in one of the recent Agronomy e-Update newsletters dated December the 7th, this past Friday, as a matter of fact, on sulfur deficiency in wheat and how to manage that. That's at agronomy.ksu.edu. And Agriculture Today returns with more in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
From the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and moving ahead with today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue is meeting today with the Office of Management and Budget to keep up the push for the second round of trade aid payments to farmers. The OMB has held up those payments, even as the Secretary told reporters at USDA's headquarters yesterday that the purchase of U.S. soybeans by China was promising. He added he had no knowledge, though, of any new agreements by China to buy more. And USDA Deputy Secretary Steve Sinskey spoke to members of the Iowa Soybean Association about trade aid payments and the Farm Bill. That trade aid right now appears directly linked to China coming back into the market to buy U.S. agricultural products, though the USDA only announced China's first purchase of beans yesterday morning. While China did buy some beans, Sinskey said that it's to be kept in perspective. He went on to say, quoting here, "We're pushing for the second half of the MFP payments to be made. We've been having discussions with the administration and our friends in the budget office." He went on to be quoted as saying, "Farmers are still feeling the impact, so we hope we'll be having a decision in the very near future." Now, the USDA yesterday did confirm what the market had expected a day earlier, that Chinese state-owned entities had purchased some 41.5 million bushels of soybeans for delivery to China during the current marketing year. Sinskey told soybean farmers it was a good start, but those buys have to get bigger. When the USDA originally announced the market facilitation program details, that formula included a payment rate which was $1.65 per bushel for soybeans, divided in half, making it 82.5 cents per bushel. The USDA stated at the time the second round of payments would be announced on December the 3rd. Expectations were the payment rate could be changed if exports had returned by then. Last week, USDA officials started pushing that date back. A USDA spokesperson emailed DTN earlier this week, stating that a decision would come before the end of the calendar year. The American Soybean Association welcomed the purchase of U.S. beans by China this week in the meantime, but said that does not mean that the administration should hold off on making that second round of aid payments to U.S. farmers. ASA president and a grower from Kentucky, Davy Stevens, said that the sales were a positive step, but that it was vital that China lift its 25% duty on imports of U.S. soybeans. Quoting Stevens, "Without removal of this tariff, it is improbable that sales of U.S. soybeans to China can be sustained." The USDA has officially launched its major pilot project for bringing high-speed internet access to rural America. With a look at that is the USDA's Gary Crawford.
Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue says America seems divided on so many levels these days.
I think our goal as public policymakers is to connect America rather than to divide America. And I know that's
Connect America by bringing high-speed broadband service to everybody in rural areas. In a brief ceremony at USDA Thursday, Perdue thanking Congress for the $600 million it gave USDA for a pilot project to demonstrate the best, most efficient ways to expand rural broadband service. Perdue said this Reconnect program will have communities submitting competitive broadband project ideas for possible USDA help.
There will be loans, there will be loan grant combinations and absolute grant combinations there for different types of efforts in our communities.
Now, there are many rules, regs, requirements, technical and financial for the projects. USDA plans workshops and webinars to help applicants with the process. For the latest information, go online to reconnect.usda.gov. Reconnect.usda.gov. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Like many, many others in agriculture, the Kansas wheat industry is hailing the final passage of the 2018 Farm Bill and eagerly awaiting the president's signature of that legislation. Marcia Boswell tells us about it on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Following several years of low farm prices, trade disruptions, and increasing international competition, passage of the 2018 Farm Bill comes at a crucial time for our farmers and ranchers. Kansas wheat farmers thank Congress for passing the 2018 Farm Bill and urge President Trump to sign the Farm Bill into law as soon as possible. According to Kansas Association of Wheat Growers President Ken Wood, Kansas wheat farmers are thankful to have a farm bill in place. It's vital to have a strong safety net, both for our farming operations and for the consumer who wants plentiful access to safe, affordable food. The Kansas Association of Wheat Growers applauds the committee for maintaining a strong crop insurance title. Wood says we're pleased that the bill helps to update and improve price loss coverage and agriculture risk coverage programs. These changes enable farmers to better respond to market and production conditions by selecting the program that works best for their operation on an annual basis. These programs and many others enacted by the Farm Bill help producers find some stability in the rocky agricultural economy, an important win-win for the farmers and the American people they work to feed, clothe, and fuel. Another important portion of the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, or Farm Bill, establishes the Agriculture Trade and Facilitation Program that funds the Market Access Program, the Foreign Market Development Program, the Emerging Markets Program, and the Trade Assistance for Specialty Crops. That is a very important amendment for wheat farmers because FMD funds directly support the ability of U.S. Wheat Associates to maintain bases of operation and local representatives to conduct trade service and technical support activities with buyers, flour millers, and wheat food processors. The legislation now allows Congress to appropriate discretionary funds to cover the cost of administering export market development programs, rather than covering costs from the appropriated program budgets. Another important change now allows qualified organizations like U.S. Wheat Associates to use program funds to conduct market development activities in Cuba, a potential new market that has been a focus of Kansas wheat farmers for years. Kansas Wheat Commissioner Doug Kiesling says, as a Kansas farmer, I know the importance of opening up new markets and how that impacts the lives of farmers. The language in this farm bill is a step in the right direction in advancing relationships between Kansas wheat farmers and the Cuban people. COG President Ken Wood concluded, Kansas wheat farmers commend the House and Senate for quickly voting on the bill and passing it out of their respective chambers with strong bipartisan support. He said, we urge President Trump to support this bill and sign it into law. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. Once more, to listen to our broadcast anytime via podcast, visit agtoday.net. You can listen on demand and find the links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify. agtoday.net. And this is Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. On we go now on Agriculture Today to Kansas agricultural weather and our weekly stint with Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. Mary, this past week, well, for the first time in a long time, we could say it was pretty much dry throughout, and the upside is that allowed producers to complete long-delayed field work, including the last vestiges of harvest.
Right. What we were looking at is statewide we averaged nothing for precipitation, and in fact, all of the divisions averaged nothing for the week. We did have a few areas in northeast Kansas where the front was slower to leave that did get some moisture and did get, in fact, some snowfall. But the greatest liquid equivalent was 0.07 of an inch. So, I mean, again, we're not talking large quantities with that. And the biggest snowfall was about 0.5 inch. So, again, not large quantities on the snow either. So that was fairly low on the precipitation side of things. On the temperature side, it was another cool week. We did end this week on a milder note, but the week that we focus on ends on the Tuesday, so that would have been the 11th of December, and we were averaging just under 4 degrees cooler than normal statewide. Not surprisingly, the western areas of the state were closest to normal. They were still ranging between 2.5 to 3 degrees cooler than normal. But again, they are typically colder, so it takes a little bit more effort to get them well below the colder than normal. The coldest area was the northeast, again, not unexpected with those cloudy skies, some snowfall, and some cold north winds out of Nebraska across their snowpack, all influenced keeping those temperatures lower in that area.
What about our soil moisture situation and the latest from the drought monitor, given that it's been a while now since we've had substantial moisture, maybe even going all the way back to the Thanksgiving weekend blizzard?
Right. We did have a little after that Thanksgiving blizzard, but December has been on the drier note. We did manage to erase the last vestiges of D0, which is abnormally dry conditions in Wabaunsee County, but we're beginning to see a little bit of the abnormally dry conditions creep north across the border in southeastern Kansas. Keep in mind, southeastern Kansas is an area of the state that does have a much higher moisture profile during the winter months than the rest of the state, so it's harder to keep up with what they should be getting. But again, it's a very small area. We're over 99% drought-free, so that's the first time in a long time that has occurred. On the soil moisture area, when we're looking at the Kansas Mesonet data, the soil moisture monitoring is not as reliable when the ground is frozen. So our 2-inch soil moisture you have to take with a lot of caution. But I've been looking at the 8-inch and the 20-inch levels, and both of those are very well saturated. So while the surface may be drying out, there is ample moisture at the mid and deeper levels.
So those well-rooted winter wheat stands, canola stands, cover crops that are out there, they're in fairly good stead.
There is moisture there available for any of those winter crops that have a good stand. Our biggest issue, as all the producers out there are well aware, was that the conditions were so wet that there's a lot of wheat that just never got planted. And there's more wheat that was late planted, so a little bit of concern about how much tillering and how much root development might have come from those later planted stands.
All right. Well, we should acknowledge as well that it was an awfully windy last 24 hours or so around Kansas, and for one thing, that raises the specter of rangeland fire danger potential again.
Right. And again, this is going to be a winter that we're going to have those ongoing concerns. It was very wet in many of the areas for the summer growing season, so a lot of fuel out there. Even in the eastern areas where drought was a big feature, there is ample fuel out there and available. Those fine fuels, those grasses, will dry down very, very quickly. And so if you've got a mild day with low humidities and a strong wind, anything that sparks a fire will result in very active fire behavior. So if you're out there doing work in the fields, if you're out with your four-wheeler checking fence or something like that, be alert to those risks. And again, in many cases, it's not somebody throwing a match out the window. It's a hot catalytic converter, a spark from a welding torch, or something of that nature that can be the trigger for a fairly dangerous event.
Well, right to it. Next week, the outlook, mild and dry.
Right, and it's been kind of a moving target for that outlook. I've been looking at this 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlook, and I started looking at it on Wednesday, and Wednesday it was favoring wetter than normal conditions. Thursday it was favoring drier than normal conditions, and this morning it's neutral, equally likely to be wetter or drier. We still have very active frontal systems coming across along the Pacific coast. And the big question is, which track will they take as they're moving eastward? If they follow the pattern of the last two, where they go through the deep south across the Texas Hill Country, we're going to be on the dry, windy side of it. If it takes a more northerly track like we saw at Thanksgiving, we could have an entirely different story. So it behooves everyone to pay attention to the outlooks and look at the forecast, especially if you're planning on doing any traveling. Look at what might be happening along your route rather than just what the local forecast might be. But at this point, it looks like we're going to have a fairly open week. It's looking for mild temperatures. We may see highs in the 50s, lows in the 20s, a little bit warmer than we normally would see at this time of the year, but certainly, and even more welcome will be the fact that we're expecting some sunshine for this time period. And we've had a number of weeks of cloudy, overcast conditions, so a little sunshine will certainly be welcome.
No doubt. And we'll follow up on that holiday travel outlook when we talk next Friday. Mary, thank you, and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
She's along with us each week to get into the Kansas agricultural weather scene. Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension, and our thanks to you as well for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.